In this episode, we take a look at the Samson Q9x microphone, which is really made for live streaming, podcasting, maybe gaming, and Zoom calls. This entire episode is recorded with the Samson Q9x, which is what you see right here. And I have that running through a Rupert Neve Design Shelford channel. And then that's running into my camera here, which is a Canon C200. That's the signal chain that you're hearing. And we are not going to do any sort of processing except for normalizing the audio levels to minus 23 LUFS. And the reason we do that is that's a reasonable loudness without requiring any sort of compression or other effects to get it to that level. Now let's get you some audio samples. We're going to compare this to two microphones that it's really not entirely fair to compare to because they're much more expensive, but this is a broadcast style microphone, and we're going to compare it to two classics, the SHURE SM7B and the Electrovoice RE20, both of which are either $400 or $450 US versus $129 US. And really the question is how does this compare to those much more expensive microphones? Let's have a listen.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. Just quickly about the Q9x, cardioid polar pattern, meaning it's directional. It picks up sound mostly on one side, starts to fall off at the edges, and then it rejects most of the sound from the back. Here's a sample where you can hear how it sounds depending on where the sound is coming from.
First, here's what the Q9x sounds like speaking directly in front of the cardioid polar pattern, 0 degrees off axis. Here is 90 degrees off axis on the Q9x. And here is 180 degrees off axis on the Samson Q9x microphone.
It does have a yoke like many other broadcast style microphones, and the body is all aluminum. It does have an internal shock mount, and here's a little sample where Emma's bumping the stand just to see how much of that transfers into the microphone. And here's a sample where I'm typing on my keyboard. It's an Apple keyboard. Let's see how much of the sound transfers to the microphone. The microphone has an integrated 2-layer grill to it, and the idea with that is to manage plosives. Plosives are the sounds that you get in a recording, in a microphone at least, when you say the letter P or B in particular. There's a little puff of air that comes out of your mouth. If that hits the microphone capsule, you'll get this really low frequency sort of boom sort of sound. It's not really pleasant. It can be fatiguing if you get a lot of those. So let's get you a sample of what it sounds like, talking directly into the microphone and with a foam cover, which should reduce some of that.
Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers. Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers.
Of course, there's an XLR output, so you can record into any audio interface or any audio recorder which has an XLR input. It's a dynamic microphone. It does not need phantom power, but it does need a lot of gain. And so that's, I think, a really important thing to keep in mind is that you're going to need a recorder that probably needs at least I would say 60 to 65 dB of gain, preferably 65, and that should be clean gain. This microphone will eat all of that up. It will really need that to get a good strong level, especially if you're doing live streaming. There is also a mid-boost switch. Let me go ahead and switch that on right now. So I've had it off this time so far, and now the mid-boost is on. I'll go ahead and leave the mid-boost on. My sense is that this microphone can sound a little bit woofy, a little muffled if you're using the foam wind cover and you don't use that. It's going to differ from voice to voice, so you just tune it to whatever sounds best for your particular voice, but this is nice. It gives you a little option. I usually have a fairly sibilant voice, and this microphone doesn't seem to emphasize sibilance like a lot of other microphones do, so that's a good thing. But if you need a little bit more clarity in the voice, doing that switching that switch to mid emphasis will help with intelligibility a good bit. The microphone design also evidently has a humbucking coil. What does that mean? It means that it should be pretty good at rejecting any sort of radio frequency interference. That's going to be wireless signals from phones and other wireless devices. Here's a sample of that. Let's run through the pros and cons. First of all, pros, obviously, is the price. $129 relative to the other two broadcast mics that we compared it to earlier. A lot less expensive. So that's one of its biggest cons. The mid-boost switch, which we already mentioned, I think is a really nice feature as well to let you tune the sound of the mic to the particular voice that's speaking into it. So if you have somebody who has a very, very bright voice, you might want to turn that off to give them a smoother sound. But if it's starting to sound a little bit kind of muffled or woofy, you can add that mid boost, and that will bring out some intelligibility, some mid-range focus. This microphone has excellent self-noise performance if you use a preamplifier with good self-noise performance. So it's really going to be the preamplifier or the audio interface or the recorder that you use that's going to define that. And again, as I mentioned before, you do need quite a bit of gain. So 60 to 65 dB easily of gain is what you need for this. And when we did that test in our very quiet recording space, sound blankets all around, brought the recording into post, normalized it to minus 23 LUFS, and then measured the portion where we didn't talk, the quiet portion, about 5 seconds worth. What we found is that the noise floor sat at minus 72 dB RMS max when we used the Sound Devices MixPre 2 recorder. So it's actually a MixPre 3 Series 2, recorder. So that's a recorder with a very clean self-noise performance metric, and this mic with that did great. So just to give you kind of a sense, it's not going to be the microphone that's creating a lot of hiss and self-noise. It's going to be whatever preamplifier that defines how much self-noise you end up with. If a chunky broadcast style look is what you're into, this delivers. However, personally, I will say I prefer to keep it out of the front of my face. That's why we have it right here. Where it's down, it's a little bit less imposing. But whatever you prefer, if you do like that kind of broadcast look to your microphones, this one delivers. The microphone does include the integrated yoke, so that makes it easy to attach to a stand. And it really kind of optimizes it for use with either a boom arm, or in my case, I'm using a low profile boom stand. I guess it's not really a boom, it's a low profile stand. And the yoke lets you position the microphone pretty much any way you want. So it's nice to have that yoke. And of course, it also comes with a foam, so you don't have to go buy that separately. The internal shock mounting seems to prevent stand bumps from transferring too much of the noise of those vibrations, so that's a pretty good thing as well. The cardioid or directional polar pattern helps pick up the sound you want and reject the sound that you don't want. So if you've got a fan in your computer running on the other side of the mic, this does a pretty good job of not picking that up. And then we also tested the RF immunity. So when you get a lot of wireless activity near the mic, how does it do? Overall, it seemed to do quite well. I wasn't able to detect any sort of interference unless I put my phone literally touching the microphone. Then I got a tiny bit of buzz, but as long as you're not having your microphone and your phone touching each other while you're recording, you should be just fine. All right, no product is perfect. Let's talk about a couple of cons, and there are just two that really come to me. Number one, it can be a little bit muddy sounding with some voices, especially with the foam cover on, but I think the mid boost solves that pretty nicely, and it solves it in a way that doesn't add a whole bunch of sibilance as well. So I think they've done a pretty nice job of voicing this microphone. Another potential con is that it does realistically require at least 60, but preferably 65 dB of very clean gain from your preamplifier, from your audio interface, from your recorder, or whatever you're plugging it into your camera. So this is not going to be something, and that's if you're using the microphone within 3 to 4 inches. So while the microphone is inexpensive, that means you're going to have to buy a more expensive or work with a more expensive preamplifier. And there are quite a few out now that are much better to work with that do supply 65 dB of gain and do it in a very clean way. So the options are getting better out there, but that is one thing to keep in mind. And if you're interested in recorders that might work well for that situation, we have an entire video that talks about all sorts of different recorders. I'll put a link for that up here. All right, so what do I think of this microphone? If you really want a broadcast style microphone, I think this can be a good choice. Is it my very first choice? I've actually more recently really enjoyed working with the Shure SM58 with a foam cover on it. It's not as impressive looking, but I think it's a microphone that works pretty well with most voices. But again, if you want the more broadcast style looking mic and you tend to have a brighter voice, this can be a pretty good option. I also like that this one does have that switch for either turning off or turning on the mid boost, so you can kind of tune it for particular voices. You don't get something like that on a Shure SM58 or a Shure SM57. So this gives you some more options, makes it a little bit more flexible for different voices. So overall, hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that, and we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.